Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to all of you who care so much about our city, our state, and our country that you have chosen to spend your evening listening to a discussion about how elections work. Thank you for being here. My name is Catherine Loving, and I am chair of the Election Law Committee at the New York City Bar Association. The experts you will be hearing from tonight are members of this committee with decades of experience in this field. I want to thank the association and its wonderful staff for their support of this event. And I want to thank our co-sponsors who are tireless in their service in support of the public good. They are the association's Diversity and Inclusion Pipeline Initiatives Committee, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Caribbean Attorneys Network, Centro Civico Cultural Dominicano, the Dominican Bar Association, the Hispanic National Bar Association Region 2, Latino Justice, the Macon B. Allen Black Bar Association, the Metropolitan Black Bar Association, the Muslim Bar Association of New York, the National Bar Association Region 2 Election Protection Committee, and the South Asian Bar Association of New York. Thank you to them, and especially to you for being here tonight. And now, here is Shanice Naidu Jimenez, Chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Pipeline Initiatives Committee.
Thank you, Catherine. Good evening, everyone. My name is Shanice Naidu Jimenez. I'm the chair of the Diversity Pipeline Initiatives Committee here at the City Bar. First, I'd like to echo Catherine's remarks by thanking our co-sponsors once again, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Before we get started, I would like to mention that my committee supports this event because now more than ever, our voices need to be heard, and especially the voices of those from underrepresented communities. So let's jump right in and learn more about the elections process and what we can do to protect our democracy. At this time, I would like to introduce our lead moderator, Mr. Henry T. Berger. Mr. Berger is one of the leading election law practitioners in New York State. He's also a trustee of the City University of New York, and Mr. Berger served as special counsel and advisor to Mayor de Blasio. So Mr. Berger, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanice, and thank you, Catherine. Thank you both for pulling this program together. By now, it's a cliche that this is a most unusual election. It is unusual politically, and for us, it is unusual legally. This year, the rules have changed, and we are in the midst of a health crisis that affects how this election is being run. Tonight, we will discuss how the changed rules and our response to the pandemic affect the electoral process. We have a distinguished panel to lead us through the discussion, so let me briefly introduce them, and then we'll get into the panel discussions. Echo Yanka is a professor at Cardozo Law School. Among other things, he also sits on the board of the Innocence Project. He previously co-chaired the New York Democratic Lawyers Council and was recently appointed as a commissioner of the newly created New York Public Finance Board. John Zaccone is a commissioner of the New York City Board of Elections. He has previously served as counsel to the Staten Island Borough President and has had an active legal practice for more than 30 years. Sarah Steiner is one of our leading election law practitioners, representing candidates, nonprofits, civic associations, and political action committees on all aspects of political activity and campaign finance law and compliance. She is a former chair of the City Bar's Election Law Committee. Lawrence Norden is the director of the Election Reform Program at the Brennan Center. Among his many other activities, he's a member of the Election Assistance Commission Board of Advisors and serves as the vice chair of its Election Security Committee. And he is the lead author of the book, The Machinery of Democracy, Protecting Elections in an Electronic World. Jorge Luis Vasquez is the director of the Power and Democracy Program at the Advancement Project, leading the project's voter protection, redistricting, rights restoration, and democracy initiative throughout the US. He is also chair of the voting rights section of the Hispanic National Bar Association. Douglas Kellner is the co-chair of the New York State Board of Elections and previously served as commissioner of the New York City Board of Elections. He is the New York State representative to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission Standards Board and serves on the advisory board of the Verified Voting Foundation. He was the first election official in the country to call for a voter-verified paper audit trail for electronic voting machines. Martin Connor is the dean of the election law bar in New York. That means he's outlasted us all. He served in the New York State Senate for 30 years and served as its minority leader and sponsored more than 100 laws, including many in the areas of election law and public ethics. He is the immediate past chair of the City Bar's Election Law Committee. And joining me to moderate this panel is India Sneed, an associate with Greenberg Trowery's Government Law and Policy Practice Group, and she has spent a decade working in city and state government. She has done campaign work as well, most notably for Jumaane Williams' lieutenant governor race and his successful race for public advocate. I thank you all for joining us tonight, and we're going to move into the panel discussions. Following the presentations, we will have the opportunity for questions. There is a Q&A button on your Zoom screen and an opportunity for discussions. So to lead us off, the first presenter is Professor Eko Yankau, and he's going to discuss, can I still donate $70,000 to a candidate for statewide office? The New York State Public Campaign Finance Board structure, status, and plans. Professor?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's terrific to be in this group. And just to echo what Ms. Loving said, it's really terrific that a group of people would take time out to really tackle these kind of questions and check not just the kind of headline cases, right, the presidential election, but to make sure that you're keeping your state healthy. So I'm here to speak about the state of the future, let me say, of New York State public finance. And I was, as Henry mentioned, I was recently named commissioner on the new public financing board, and I'm very much looking forward to that work. Let me take a moment to just tell people kind of the shape of this project. Forgive me, Catherine, will you remind me how long I meant to speak? Was it? I thought so, 10 minutes, right? So I'll try not to abuse, we academics are too often given the ability to abuse our brief. But I do want to spend a few minutes talking to people about why this matters so much. So you may be shocked to learn that over the last set of elections, the last one for which we have great data, the top 100 donors in New York State gave more money in political campaigns than the next 137,000 combined. That is to say, a small group of people utterly dominate the finances of New York State. And as a result, if we're honest, well, we could politely say wield outsized influence in our state elections, but utterly dominate is really the kind of phrase we're looking for here. That is to say, it has a deleterious effect both on the candidates we get, and even when we get very fine candidates, the kind of policies they may feel liberated to pursue. And so New York State, including a slew of people on this phone call and probably a slew of people in this webinar, advocates for New York State's public financing have been fighting a long time to change the basic structure of our public financing, and we have now succeeded. We have now passed into law, although not yet brought to life in action, a new set of campaign finance reforms. And I just want to give people the shape of that campaign finance reform. As Henry mentioned, it is true that we have reduced vastly the limits on how much people can give. If memory serves, different races can give somewhat different amounts. And if I'm honest, at the last minute, there was some negotiation, numbers that had moved down, got bumped back up again. Though I try to remember every single race and the limits of each race, I think the outside number for statewide general elections is just over $47,000 or something along these lines. But even if that number still remains very, very large, well, let me first say that number has been significantly reduced from what it used to be. And even if that number remains still all too large, should not obscure the larger structural changes we have made to the public campaign financing. So here's the regime that New York is facing in the future. And I know lawyers don't love math, but the math is fairly straightforward. In a campaign now, there will be a system of public financing matching that is roughly modeled on the kind of system we see in New York State, but it will apply for the whole state. This system will take into account matches both within and outside of your district, right? So that's to say, if you get $100 from a constituent outside, depending on the election, statewide elections are obviously different, but outside your district might be matched at one level. But let's talk about inside your district. So Sarah Smith is a small, thoughtful community organizer. She's on the PTA. She works very, very hard. She supports her community. She's known as somebody who matters in the neighborhood. And Sarah has flirted with the idea of running for office, but that's not for her. Let's be serious. Sarah is not connected to big name donors. In the old days, we used to say her Rolodex. Her Rolodex is not filled with millionaires and billionaires. And so she's always thought to herself, I'm not the kind of person who runs and wins these things. Enter the new law. What does the new law do? For every donation Sarah gets, up to $250, the New York Public Campaign Financing Fund will match that number. And it'll match it anywhere from 12 to 8 times. The math can be a little bit slippery, but it's not dramatically difficult. The first $50 she gets will be matched at a rate of 12 to 1. That is to say, if her friends give her $10, that turns into $130. They're $10, and then another 12 to 1 match. Suddenly, Sarah can really think about running. If somebody gives her $50, it's matched at 12 to 1. That's quite incredible. The next $100 is matched at 9 to 1. And then the next $100 after that, excuse me. I have a motion sensor that does not find my talking quite active enough. And then the next $100 after that is matched at 8 to 1. The point is, Sarah now has the ability, by convincing her neighbors and friends that she is who they thought she is, that she has good ideas for their community, that she can help promote the health of her district, that if they are willing to donate even in small amounts, they can now make a real run at a statewide election. They can now make a real push at a statewide election. And so the Sarahs of the world can run now in ways that they couldn't run before. I want to notice one other equally important thing. While it's true that now Sarah can run, even if her cell phone isn't full of billionaires and billionaires, it is equally true that if Sarah wins, the kind of politician she can be is going to be vastly different. It's just a different thing if a politician knows that they have 3 or 5 donors within their district that funded their campaign, people whose outsized paychecks or checkbooks dominated their ability to win. If, on the other hand, Sarah knows that by having policies that appeal to a broad enough swath of her district, she can continue to fight for re-election with small donor amounts, Sarah can be a politician who's receptive to a cross section of her district. So though I enjoy talking about the nitty gritty, though I'm, geekier than most and really, it's really enjoyable to talk about the numbers and which number is matched at 12, which number is matched. The basic idea couldn't be simpler. The basic idea is that public small donation campaign finance allows a more democratic set of people to run for office, run on the strength of their ideas, run on the strength of their community, run on who they represent. And that means that all sorts of fresh new ideas can make it to Albany or to whatever office you want. If we think this election and this moment and the protests out there have been telling us that we want more new voices out there, this kind of reform can do that. At the same time, it means that when those people run, they are not indebted to a few high-powered individuals. They can be at the service of a broader swath of their community. And I'll close by saying the result of this is obvious. It means not just more democracy, but in particular, more democracy for vulnerable communities. The Brennan Center, the nonpartisan good governance group, has found that this kind of reform has led to much greater political participation among women, among communities of color, among Latino communities, and obviously among poor communities. This kind of reform makes democracy alive for everybody. And for everybody protesting in the streets and caring about every election, translating that into direct, actionable political power, meaning that we don't just shout for new voices, but we elect them, is at the heart of our democracy. And that's why a boring kind of thing like campaign finance reform can be the very heartbeat of New York's future democracy. At the risk, I won't risk going on any longer. That'll be my opening, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Echo. Let me just add, one unique feature of the program is that the match is only for contributions up to $250. If a person gives more than $250, no portion of the contribution is matched. This is really built in to encourage the small contributors to dominate the financing of campaigns.
Absolutely. I hope I use the example of the first 50, the second 100, and the third, and then the third 100, adding to that 250. I should have made clear that after that there'll be no more matches. And so you're absolutely right.
It eliminates the match for the first $250 also.
That's right. So in fact, the point here again is somebody who gives $70 is suddenly hugely powerful in a way that the person who writes the largest check is not, or more to the point, 50 people giving you $70 suddenly have a lot of power.
Thank you. So moving on to the question, which I'm sure all of us have, is who really runs New York City elections? The New York City Board of Elections authority, structure, services to candidates, and services to voters. Commissioner John Zaccone, enlighten us.
Thank you. It's a lot to try to get into a few minutes, but I'll try my best. First, I want to thank everybody for attending and listening to us this evening on a subject that that while being vitally important, may be very boring. I also want to thank Catherine Loving for organizing this and setting it up for us so that we can try to dispense knowledge. Excuse me. First thing I'll say is any comments made are my own. They are not comments of the city bar. They are not the opinions of the New York City Board of Elections. They are personal and private to me. In response to who runs the elections in New York City, well, the Board of Elections for the City of New York technically runs the elections subject to the New York State Constitution, New York State election law, and the rules set up by the Board of Elections for the state of New York. Lately, they've also been subject to the emergency proclamations of the governor, which has made life extremely interesting for us in the past few months leading up to the primary election, when things changed very suddenly, very quickly. But subject to the requirements of the New York State Constitution, state law, and the New York City Board of Elections is the one that actually runs the election, sets up the polling places, sends all the equipment out, runs the day of election day, runs the 9 days of early voting beforehand. And please, I'll take this time right now to anybody who's listening, please vote early if you can, avoid the lines. We are encouraging everybody to take full advantage of absentee voting, of early voting, I should say. And the ones who cannot, please do the absentee, but the preference is for early voting for everybody. The Board of Elections in the City of New York is structured with 10 commissioners, 2 for each borough, 1 from the top 2 parties getting the highest votes in the last general election for governor. In this case, presently, it is Democrats and Republicans. Each county has its own county board office where all the administrative and processes for the election are conducted for the county, and New York City Board of Elections a general office where we have a general office staff and where the commissioners meet on a weekly basis. That's primarily what our structure is. How votes get counted, it depends on how votes come in. On election day and during early voting period, a voter comes into the office where the early voting site is or where their election day site is. They are checked in using our poll pads, which are equipment that will have the voter data and signatures on it. The voter will be asked to sign in. After the voter signs in, the signatures will be compared. If the voter is the same and the signatures match or are similar, then the voter will be given a ballot. That ballot will be then taken by the voter to a privacy booth, completed, and from the privacy booth, they will then take it to a scanner. There will be at least 2 scanners at every location. Several locations have many more. And the voter will take the ballot to the scanner and put it directly into the machine. The scanner will then accept or reject the ballot. They can see if there's a mark on it or there's something incomplete, or it'll say if it is an overvote or a question about it, and tell the voter, are you sure you want to deposit this into the voting system? After that, it's read by the machine. The ballot goes into the box and the vote is counted on the machine. At the end of the day, the machine is then opened by a bipartisan team from the Board of Elections. Data sticks are taken from them and the ballots are taken from them and put into bags that are locked and sealed, again by the bipartisan team, and removed to, in Staten Island's case, to the general board. In other boroughs' case, they take it to the police, to a police precinct where they're held there and then delivered to the board afterwards. The sticks, there are 2 sets of data sticks that come in that have the information of what happened that day on that machine. One stick is immediately read on the computer at the website and transmitted to the board. The other stick is protected and given to the police officer and then transmitted again to the precinct or to the board office later, and is used to do the ultimate determination of the votes on that ballot. That's basically the voting process for in-person and early voting. The question is, or the issue that comes in from June and from other jurisdictions, is what happens to ballots that are mailed in. Now, mail-in ballots can be military ballots, can be absentee ballots. Those ballots come in by mail through the U.S. Postal Service or can be dropped off at any board office or any voting site. What I didn't touch on before on the Board of Elections voting sites and early voting sites and offices is that there will be boxes set up there so that a voter can come into the facility, not have to wait online, but just deposit their absentee ballot directly into the box. The box is locked and it's opened up at the end of the evening and by a bipartisan team and taken just as the ballots are. So they're protected there and no one has to worry about the Postal Service or anybody else or any other places to give them. You don't have to worry about giving it to somebody and making sure it gets there. You can just put them in the box during the early voting, during election day, and at any board office. Absentee and military votes have to be received in person at the board office by the end of election day. If they are mailed in, any received up to the end of election day are automatically counted when we get to the counting phase. Ones that are mailed in should be postmarked by election day. And then the statute allows a 7-day period from the end of elections to 7 days afterwards for absentee or military ballots to come into the office from the U.S. Postal Service. In addition to that, there is a provision that if it comes in the day after Election Day without a postmark, but through the Postal Service, it will be counted by the board. So basically, that's how absentee ballots and military ballots get to the board office. In New York City, each one goes to the county office where the person lives and it's addressed to them. Then those ballots are held for a 7-day period to wait to make sure that all the ballots are in by mail, and they can be compared during that time to people who have voted in person. We try not to let you vote twice. The practice is, if you vote, and it's in the state law, if you vote in person, your absentee ballot is void. It is no good. So even if you voted early and you decide to change your mind, you can still go on Election Day and vote in person. The in-person vote will count over the absentee ballot. If you file more than one absentee ballot, the last one dated or the last one received is the one that will count. We have in place records, electronic records that will tell us who voted and when they voted so that it can be compared so that people can vote more than once, at least in their own name. After the 7-day period has lapsed and we've seen everybody all the ballots that have come in, and we've compared them and checked the dates and make sure that there are no conflicts and no one voted personally, then those ballot envelopes are opened in front of representatives of the candidates who are involved. They're invited to be there, and they can observe the opening of the ballot, and they can contest any of the absentee or military ballots that are there for one of several reasons the statute provides. If there is no contest, and if the bipartisan team who reviews the ballots agrees that it's a valid ballot, the ballot will be taken out, put into a pile, mixed up so that nobody knows who exactly voted for who, and then they will be counted. If there is a contest regarding the ballots, generally what we do is if there are orders in relief in place from the courts, we will take a photocopy of the envelope, we will take a photocopy of the ballot, we will put the ballot back in the envelope, and we will preserve that for a court determination. At the end of the day, after all of that is done and all the contests in the courts have been, resolved themselves and the judges have told us what to do regarding counting the ballots, we will then issue a final canvass of the votes and issue our reports to the state. In this case, we have over 1 million ballots, absentee ballots have been requested by citizens of the city of New York. So we used to imagine that it will be a monumental job to count them. Each borough is setting up their own people, their own facilities, their own processes for trying to do that in as quick as possible, depending on what they are. I know some counties are looking into having other locations so that much more can be done, bigger than their existing offices, to try to maximize the people who will be able to count and to observe and to make sure that this goes over smoothly, quietly, and hopefully happy for the voters in general. That, I think, is a quick and dirty response to how we do this. And I'm open to any questions that I have that I would be able to answer. I don't know if there are any. If any of the questions from the other panel members, I'm happy to listen as well.
We're going to hold questions and discussion till after the presentations. And you've really led us right into the next topic, because with early voting, absentee voting, and voting on election day, people have raised the questions, even somebody in Washington, can I vote twice? Sarah Steiner is going to discuss how we legally and transparently count ballots in New York and what the legal issues are. Sarah?
Hi. Well, I actually was going to say everything that John said. That was my presentation because that was the absentee ballots.
Sorry, Sarah.
But so I'm going to just wing it now. So one of the things that happens here is that when ballots come out into the light, they go to the campaigns. The campaigns can make a request for the absentee ballot envelopes of the invalid and the valid ballots, the ones that are preliminarily considered valid or invalid. And while I've been trying to get the board to give them to the campaigns in digital form, I've been told that their interpretation of the election law is that only pieces of paper are deliverable, and therefore the campaigns get usually bankers boxes. Last election, they got bankers boxes full of paper. In 4 out of 5 of the counties in New York City, they were divided into preliminarily valid and preliminarily invalid. In the 5th county, they were just delivered and we had to guess. The function of this is so that the campaign can decide whether or not they're going to challenge the determination of the board, whether it's valid or it's invalid. If the board has ruled a ballot valid, but, and this is almost never what happens, that the board rules something valid that is invalid. If there's a reason that a campaign thinks that that vote shouldn't be counted, which would pretty much be limited to somebody else signed the ballot, it's dated after the date of the election, or maybe they've looked at the poll book and they know that the voter voted in person and it's one of the very rare ones that wasn't caught by the board, because you really can't vote twice. Once you voted on the machine, your absentee ballot isn't valid anymore. But more so, campaigns tend to want all the ballots that were cast counted, and they go through the absentee ballots and also something called an affidavit ballot, which is a ballot done in person at the voting site, but where the board's poll book doesn't have that voter reflected as being enrolled in the ED and AD where they've shown up to vote. So more frequently, a campaign would be looking to make a valid that's been preliminarily invalid declared valid. And we would do that by finding the voter in the voter rolls, making sure, in a general election, you'd only find the voter in the voter rolls. In a primary, you'd find their enrollment as well. But sometimes in the haste of checking everything, a valid ballot slips through and they didn't find the voter. So we look for the voter to try to find the voter. We may look for the voter in a voter database like VAN or something like that, and find that the voter voted in Manhattan, but used to be a voter up in Westchester County. And that's still due to the law changes from the last year. It's a portable registration now. They can still vote in wherever they live now. And so that ballot would be counted and their registration would be transferred to their new voting address. So the way that this works is that the board's process of counting the ballots is open to the public. And so once the campaigns have the ballots, they would bring those ballots to the attention of the borough board, and the borough board would review it to see whether or not they agree that they made the erroneous preliminary determination of validity or invalidity. And then the ballots get counted. The ballots get counted in a way that should be relatively quick and sometimes winds up getting hung up, and that's what sometimes takes more time. The way the ballots ought to be counted is that all the ballots that are you're starting with an assembly district as the baseline grouping of counting votes, and then you do the lowest number ED election district inside of that. You go through the ballots, you make sure that all of them in the envelopes are in fact unobjected to valid ballots. They get slid open, as John Zaccone said, they get put over to the side, they get mixed up so that you don't know which ballot came from which person's envelope, so that the anonymity of your vote is still there, and then they get fed through the scanner. Sometimes people who are observing make comments about the ballots or want to see the ballots, but in an ordinary count of the ballots at an ordinary opening of absentee ballots which is not a recount or a hand count or anything else, nobody has the right to examine individual ballots as they're taken out of the envelopes according to the election law. Sometimes that's done, and I think it slows down the process and is a mistake when it happens. But all of these ballots, they just get fed through the machines, and you get a result, and you get a rolling total that tells you where the vote is going. At the end, the day of and early voting total is aggregated with the absentee total, and that becomes the vote that, barring any litigation, the kinds of which Marty Connor is going to talk about at some point, that becomes the certified result of the Board of Elections. And that's how absentee ballots get processed. Between the two of us, I think we may have covered it all.
Well, thank you. You know, we've discussed New York, but we've heard rumors from other jurisdictions that they may not be able to get all of their ballots counted by election night, and we won't have results on election night. And each state has their own sets of requirements. So the question arises, is it chaos, or is it actually administrators following the rules? Larry Norton, can you help us understand mail-in ballot requirements in the battleground states?
Yeah, thanks, Henry. And thank you, Catherine and the City Bar for organizing this, and everybody who is watching for taking the time out. So the Brennan Center, of course, is based at NYU. We are in New York, but we're a national organization, and in this election, we've been spending most of our time working in states other than New York. So I'm going to fill folks in on a lot of the stuff that John and Sarah talked about, but looking at the battleground states where we've been very focused as a point of comparison. So if I get anything wrong on New York, John, Sarah, I think Doug is going after me. One of you can correct me. As I said, that's not where I've been spending as much time this year. So first I'm gonna see if I can pull this PowerPoint up. Let's see if I can do that. All right. So bear with me for a sec. There we go. So, sorry. Yeah, a little technical problem there. I'm going to try again. Apologies. All right, I seem to be having some trouble with this, but it's all right.
Larry, if it's helpful, we can see it.
Okay, you can see it?
Yes, we're currently on the slide that says online absentee ballot request tool, and it has the map of the United States.
All right, great. All right, so one of the big things that we saw in the primaries was that states had a lot of problem, particularly battleground states like Wisconsin and Georgia, processing the huge numbers of mail ballot applications that they got in. The good news is that, like New York, a lot of states now have online tools for requesting absentee ballots, and that should make the process of processing these applications a lot faster. And in fact, we seem to have mostly seen that, although there have been some issues. The one battleground state that the Brennan Center has been focused on that does not have an online system is Ohio. Actually, the Brennan Center was involved. We filed an amicus brief. There was a lawsuit that the Democratic Party brought to force the state to allow for online applications for mail ballots. We originally actually won that in the trial court, but that got reversed on appeal. That's kind of something that we've been seeing with appeal reversals around the country in recent weeks. Let me see if I can continue here. Okay, so John talked a little bit about the ballot return deadlines for New York. New York, unlike a lot of the battleground states, allows ballots to be postmarked as long as they're postmarked by November 3rd to be received later through November 10th, in fact. And John mentioned some additional things, even if they're not postmarked, if they're received but the following day, they can still be processed and counted. In most of the battleground states, and there's been a lot of litigation around this, with decisions going back and forth, which I think can be very confusing to voters. But in most of the battleground states that we've been tracking, you're going to have to get your ballot in by election day. So even if you've sent it a week early, 2 weeks early, and it's not received by election day, it's not going to be counted. And in fact, in Michigan today, we heard both the Secretary of State and the governor say basically don't mail your mail ballots back now. We've got a lot of drop boxes. That's the safer thing to do because we can't guarantee, believe it or not, if you're mailing out your ballot almost 2 weeks ahead of time, that it's going to get in on time. There are exceptions to this, the general rule for battleground states. Folks may have seen there was a Supreme Court decision not to stay the order of an appeals court. So for the time being, anyway, it seems that in Pennsylvania, the rule is that as long as I think the ballot is received 3 days after election day, but postmarked by election day, that should be counted. Although I will say that was a 4-4 non-decision, and it's possible that could get reversed later. So I would certainly advise people in Pennsylvania to try to get their ballots in before election day. We have a similar situation in North Carolina where both the State Court of Appeals and the Fourth Circuit ruled in a 12-3 decision that voters had extra time, as long as their ballots were postmarked by election day, there's a period of time, I think 9 days, for which the ballots can still be received and counted, although the three dissenters in that Fourth Circuit decision strongly urged the plaintiffs to appeal to the Supreme Court. So my general rule is in all of these states to be telling people that they really want to get their ballots in by election day. I think it's very confusing for voters, and frankly, last minute changes in particular that start restricting voting, I think can be very, very damaging. And unfortunately, we've seen a bit of that this year in the courts. Of course, you don't have to mail back your mail ballot. John talked about this in New York although New York doesn't have drop boxes, for early voting. A lot of states have drop boxes. States like Arizona and Florida have them for, every few thousand voters, they will have a drop box essentially. Other states like Ohio only have one per county. Folks may have seen there's litigation going on in Texas still. The governor limited the number of drop boxes that they have in the state to one per county, which is a bit crazy when you look at the difference in size of counties in Texas. You have Harris County, which has millions of voters, and you have some counties that only have a few thousand voters. They both get one drop box and only one drop box. But for the most part, states have adapted around the country, and in particular in these battleground states, to put lots of drop boxes in. So that's going to be very helpful with this confusion about when mail ballots have to get back. A lot of states, like New York, allow dropping off ballots at early voting sites. But there's still a number that do not. And that includes Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Georgia. On the other hand, there are states that allow drop off on election day. And one thing that John talked about was having a separate box in the polling place. The procedures around this are really going to matter. If you just have to wait in line to vote your mail ballot, that's not necessarily going to be very appealing to a lot of voters. But there are states, and it sounds like New York and certainly Arizona, where there's like a separate line for people that have their mail ballots to return them and drop them off at the polling place on election day. An issue that's received a lot of attention has been the ability to cure your mail ballots. New York, actually, this was settled in New York State. This was by settlement in terms of the time that voters have to cure their mail ballots. So, one of the big issues with mail ballots and them getting rejected is failure to sign the envelope or a mismatched signature. And courts have generally been ruling that voters should be given the opportunity to fix those technical errors. New York, relative to many other states, actually gives a fairly long amount of time for voters to come back and to fix those problems. It may still not be enough, but in New York, voters have up to 7 days after being notified that there's a problem to cure their ballots, 5 days after notification if the ballot arrives after November 3rd. And finally, something that's received a lot of attention in the national media is when absentee ballot processing and counting happen. Obviously we know it took a really long time to count the New York mail ballots in the primary. A lot of the nightmare scenarios that we've been reading about in the media is that potentially, because there's such a skew in how people are voting, Democrats tend to be voting very heavily by mail and early. It looks like Republicans are going to vote disproportionately in person on election day. That we might not know what the presidential election results and national election results are going to look like on election night, because we may have a situation like we saw in New York during the primaries or Pennsylvania, where it was weeks until all the absentee ballots were counted. And B, that you might have President Trump declare that he was the winner because the election night results, which are in-person votes, are counted early and are likely to skew heavily towards him. The good news on this is, in fact, that media account has been a little bit oversimplified. In fact, many states, in particular Florida, North Carolina, Arizona, start processing and even tabulating their mail ballots way before election day. So in fact, in those states and some others like Iowa, you may actually see those results first. It is quite likely that those states will have almost all of their ballots counted on election night. The standouts on this are three pretty important states. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin do not allow processing of ballots until election day. And in Michigan, they're allowed to start processing them 10 hours ahead of time in some locations. But the election officials there are saying it's likely going to take a week in Michigan I shouldn't say a week, by the end of the week, Friday, before they're fully counted all the votes. And in Pennsylvania, they're saying it could take even longer. So, if the election does come down to the three states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, we may indeed be in for a very late election night. So I'll stop there.
Before you stop, since you mentioned drop boxes a lot, can you just quickly discuss the California drop box situation, where the Republican Party is kindly providing additional drop boxes?
Yeah, so I think a big problem with the California Republican Party drop boxes, one of the big problems was they were listed as official drop boxes, which they weren't. But my understanding is that issue has mostly been resolved, that the Republican Party has removed a lot of their drop boxes, and they also agreed to have official people manning those drop boxes. The challenge, of course, if it's not an official drop box, is that somebody might go through them, and you're basically leaving your ballot with somebody that you don't know, and people could be deceived because it says official drop box, and then you don't want somebody discarding ballots that they don't like from people that they don't like. So, but I think that issue has mostly been resolved in California, Henry, from what I understand.
Thank you. Moving on, we have an increasingly diverse electorate. And the issue arises that with many languages but one democracy, how do we protect voters? Jorge Vasquez, can you pick up on that, please?
Yeah, I think the first thing to understand is that America is extremely diverse. And when we look at the electorate and eligible voters by breakdown, we know that over 21 million voters, 10% of voters, 2020 election, are naturalized citizens, many of them who speak a language other than English. When we look at the Latinx Hispanic community, we're talking about 32 million eligible voters, right? The largest ethnic minority bloc, many whose predominant language is Spanish. What we know is that the United States colonized Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is a commonwealth, and that the individuals from Puerto Rico have a right to language access and a ballot in Spanish. And what we look at is that we have certain laws that protect the ability for individuals who are citizens to cast a ballot in their dominant language. And in recognizing that, we need to remind folks sometimes that the United States does not have an official language, and that English itself is a foreign language. So we need to start from that premise. And starting from that premise, we look at the Voting Rights Act, and Section 203 provides for a formula that says for certain minority groups, some people from Asian communities, from Latinx communities, you're entitled to a non-English ballot if your community fulfills a certain number. And that formula changes with the census data, mainly the American Community Survey. And you can find out that information usually by going to the DOJ and Googling, the Section 203 Voting Rights Act, and it'll come up with the formula, and you'll see what places, generally everywhere in New York City, you're covered in English, Spanish, and in English, in other languages that are Asian. And the other thing is for Puerto Ricans. When we look at presidential elections, we know that presidential elections, let's just look at the 2000 election in Florida, right? 538 votes determined who the president was at that election. And what we know, looking at what happened in 2016, is that in many swing states, the decision was made by less than 1% of eligible voters in that state. We also know that we had Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and that many people from Puerto Rico have migrated to the mainland since then. Many of them going to states like Florida, states like Pennsylvania, Michigan. And what that means for those states is that, there's no number requirement when you're dealing with Section 4E of the Voting Rights Act, which says any person who's born on US land that has a school with a US flag and is educated to at least the 6th grade is entitled to a ballot in that language. And for Puerto Ricans who are born in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, who are educated at least to the 6th grade and come into the mainland, it doesn't matter where in New York you are, right? It doesn't matter where in the state. According to Section 4E, you're entitled to language assistance. At the same time, it's important to understand Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act and the ability to have an assister of your choice. And that assister of your choice may be an individual who's not a US citizen, as long as it's not your union representative, as long as it's not a candidate itself, and as long as it's not your employer walking you in to cast that ballot, then you are entitled to choose who you want to help you. As it relates to the national pandemic that we're seeing, what we know for the Latinx community is that vote by mail isn't a one-size-fits-all because of language access. And we need to be cognizant of that fact that for many voters who are predominantly, let's say Spanish in my example, just because that's what we speak in my household, that those voters might need assistance and might not be able to get the assistance that they need. And one of the challenges we face is how do we ensure that individuals who need assistance get that assistance as it relates to language access. As we look at New York City, 1 in 4 voters in New York City are Latinx, and more than half of them, their predominant language is Spanish. So we're looking at a large voting bloc within New York City alone that quite frankly and literally, in order to cast a meaningful ballot, need a ballot in their predominant language. When we look at many of the ballot initiatives, even as attorneys, and maybe I'm alone, I might be the only attorney on this panel who has to read a ballot initiative twice when I'm at the polls to make sure that it is what I think it is. I could not imagine not being able to do that in my dominant language, right? Like I have a training for this, I write ballot initiatives, I interpret the law, yet I'm still need a few minutes to look at it to make sure I'm reading it accurately, right? Making sure I see where is the comma at, making sure to see if there's any except, right? So that's super important this election. And we see New York City is becoming extremely diverse, as is the nation. So in kind of summarizing it up, I think it's important to remember America doesn't have an official language. English itself is a foreign language, and that the Voting Rights Act calls for a formula under Section 203 that mandates certain actions be taken for individuals whose dominant language is other than English. And that for, my relatives that are coming from Puerto Rico here, that there's no number requirement for how many Puerto Ricans you have in your state. And the law, has been up and down throughout the circuits, but it's been upheld every time that I'm aware of, that you're able to have a ballot in Spanish. And then lastly, really focusing in on the fact that everyone, even if you're not entitled under Section 203 to have a ballot in the language, in your dominant language, you're certainly entitled to have an assister of your choice. Someone who you trust to walk into that polls to translate whatever it is you need. And as you know, the largest municipal bar association, right? The city bar, I think it's important for us to amplify that message and ensure that we continue to promote inclusiveness, and in including that inclusiveness as attorneys, just pointing to those resources. And those 3 resources I pointed out to are Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, Section 4E of the same act, and Section 208. And with that, I'll turn back to you, Henry, and thank you for asking that question and for having me.
Thank you, Jorge. If I can go off script a little bit and impose on you, Kathleen, my recollection is that the Campaign Finance Board did some work with interpreters for the elections. Can you tell us what the status of that is?
I could give you a little update about some of the stuff they did, because I think it's amazing. The Campaign Finance Board has gone above and beyond, and what they did was they went and started translating documents to ensure that everyone in New York City who spoke languages other than English was able to get accurate information, trustworthy information. And by trustworthy information, Google Translate might work well for a personal site, but certainly not for a government site. And what Campaign Finance did was ensure that its materials are accessible to individuals who speak Arabic, individuals who speak Chinese, individuals who speak multiple languages that are not covered by Section 203. And it's truly, truly, truly serving as a model for how municipalities that are diverse like New York City should do to make sure that its residents feel comfortable participating in elections. And I'm sorry, I know that question wasn't geared towards me, but it was the one thing from an outsider looking in, I just wanted to acknowledge publicly.
And I thank you, Jorge, for saying that. And that came from the mayor's office, Henry, when you were there. So thank you very much for guiding us in that direction.
And are there interpreters of additional non-voting rights language interpreters being provided at poll sites?
These are being provided now, as John can tell us, by the Civic Engagement Commission is providing interpreters at a number of poll sites, many poll sites.
That is correct.
And
And I believe the dominant languages are in Russian and in Korean, at least the poll sites that I've seen, and there's a list of them that they're providing. Unfortunately, they're not providing them at all the locations where there may be a demand, but they're providing them to some of them, and I'm not sure of their criteria. And how
You have Bengali requirements in parts of Queens.
Well,
Bengali, yeah.
Yeah, there's Bengali. That's not the official. The New York City Board of Elections provides interpreters to the voting rights languages as required, and we provide the ballots in those languages as well. If you ever take a look at a ballot for the borough of Queens, you'll see a rather convoluted ballot with all the different languages listed there, and they do it. I will say for myself, from past experience, it is very difficult to get interpreters in some of the Asian languages. And we've had a great deal of difficulty with that, despite reaching out to the various community groups and organizations and the government groups. It's difficult for us to fill the requirements for Election Day. So if anybody has any people who would be interested in doing it, have them contact the Board of Elections for the City of New York, and we will try to put them through training and get them ready for Election Day.
Language accessibility in a city that speaks more than 200 languages is an ongoing issue, and something I think we're still working on. But
absolutely,
if I could just a really quick note, because this conversation is a reminder that as much as we think of New York as obviously the most cosmopolitan and liberal place on God's green earth, that it's precisely language accessibility that meant New York State and New York City were covered under the Voting Rights Act. Yeah, and it can be a very easy knee-jerk thing to think, that, oh, that's Southern problem. But indeed, it's precisely this fights which good people of goodwill on all sides have always fought, but others who cared more about strategic tallying than democracy have not always.
Thank you. Well, Doug, back in 1996, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, in a, as I recall, in a post-election litigation, ruled that New York is not entitled to a perfect election. It's only entitled to a fair election. Now, almost exactly 24 years later, does democracy require perfect elections? And how does that tie in with what we're doing now with voting by mail? And how is New York handling that?
All right. Well, we have to strive for perfection. It's very important for democracy that every vote counts and that every vote be counted, and only legitimate votes be counted. So that has to be the goal. But also we should recognize that it's virtually impossible to run a 100% perfect, flawless election, given the fact that we have more than 60,000 poll workers in New York State who need to be trained, but who have to carry out fairly complex duties, just usually 2 days a year. So no matter how much training you give them, they don't get enough day-to-day practice in order to do everything perfectly. But that being said, we still need to strive to do everything properly and to reach out for that goal. Now, let me summarize by saying that I think the consensus among election officials and good government groups is that you have 3 ways to vote in New York. That the best way, if you can do it, is early voting. The early voting sites, there are many early voting sites, especially in New York City and in the suburban counties. The sites have been underutilized in the 2 elections where we've had early voting, so that lines are very rare. If you go and vote in person at an early voting site, you know that your vote is going to be counted. So that errors in marking the ballot are caught by the scanners as you scan the ballot in yourself. And when you put your ballot in the scanner and the scanner says that it's received your vote and thank you for voting, you know that that ballot is going to be counted. And those results are reported on election night. New York still has in-person voting on election day. There are 1,200 poll sites in New York City. But we know historically that in a general election for president, that there are long lines at some sites. And so you can avoid those long lines by taking the trouble to go to your early voting site at a time that's convenient for you during the 9 days of early voting, which starts this Saturday and runs until the following Sunday before Election Day. So that's an important message I want to give everybody. Then with absentee voting, New York has had to adjust very quickly to meet the COVID emergency in dealing with absentee ballots. Certainly there were many problems in the primary, and I would estimate that between 100,000 and 200,000 voters did not get their absentee ballots in time to have those ballots counted in the primary election. The problem was especially bad in New York City, but the good news is that the New York City Board of Elections has taken a number of very positive steps so that I'm confident that the problems that we had in the primary are not going to be repeated for the presidential election. And one of the messages is that if you are going to vote absentee, then the best way to apply for your ballot is online. In the primary, only 40% of the voters applied for their absentee ballots online. That figure is, I'm told, almost double that for the general election. And that skips the steps of having to receive the application by mail and then to have somebody hand copy that information into the system in order to process it. The next best way to apply for an absentee ballot in the current election is by telephone. Why? Well, because if you're not comfortable applying online yourself, if you apply by telephone, you're going to get an operator who's going to essentially fill out the online application for you. And again, that will short circuit a number of problems and make it much more efficient for the boards of elections to process your application. You're legally allowed to apply by mail, but as so many people before have stated, it's really too late to do that now. Early voting is the best option. You can vote in person if you want, and the boards of elections have taken a number of steps to implement social distancing and to make the poll sites as safe as possible. I would say that it is safer to go to a poll site on election day, or better yet, on early voting, than it is to go to a grocery store. That the regimen for social distancing is significantly better. Now, one of the things that I was asked to address is the changes that New York will need to implement if we're going to switch to making this vote by mail option freely available and go to a much larger number of absentee ballots. For this year, the legislature and the governor passed a law that basically said that fear of COVID and concern about contracting COVID falls within the category of an illness excuse that basically makes it constitutional to vote by mail. But the New York State Constitution says that you must vote in person unless you fit into one of two categories, either because you can't vote in person because of illness or disability, or that you are out of the county, or in the case of New York City, out of the city on election day. The legislature has already granted first passage to a constitutional amendment to change that provision, to remove it. And it's very likely that the legislature will give second passage very early in the next legislative session, which means that repealing those restrictions on absentee voting will be on the ballot in November of 2021 for adoption by the voters. If New York goes to that, Larry Norton has already gone through some of the disconnects in New York for absentee voting, and we will need to address making absentee voting more efficient as we go to that system. It's not realistic to do it for this year, But in the future, we'll need to change to a system where to make it easier for people to apply for their absentee ballots or vote by mail ballots, and to provide that we can start counting those ballots on election day. But to do that, that will mean that we'll have to eliminate the New York rule that you can vote in person if you've cast an absentee ballot. Obviously, once you've been mailed an absentee ballot, if we're going to be counting on election day, then you're not going to be allowed to vote in person on election day if you've been sent that ballot. And what most other states do is provide that a voter who applied for an absentee ballot but hasn't received it will have to vote in person by an affidavit ballot, and that affidavit will be counted if the board does not have the absentee ballot. So that's what's in our future. We should think long and hard about the problems that arise from voting by mail, because we're now depending on the Postal Service to be part of election administration. That departs from the historic bipartisan administration that we have traditionally had in New York. And I should have added one feature that hasn't been talked about yet, is that the Postal Service guidelines provide that if your mailed ballot does not have sufficient postage or is missing postage, the post office is still required to deliver that ballot to the Board of Elections. And if the Board of Elections receives it, it will be counted. So a lot of the concerns that people have had about postage, while the state did not want to fund postage return mail, which would cost $6 million statewide, the post office will still deliver your ballot if you fail to put a stamp on it or have inadequate postage. All right, so we can move on to our next speaker. And
Henry, before we do, I know there's been a lot of talk about early voting and early voting locations and trying to encourage people to do that. If anyone does not know their early voting location in New York City, they can look on the New York City website. It's vote.nyc, and they will be able to tell you where your election day site is, where your early voting site is, and also give you a sample ballot if you want to review before you get to the poll site on election day.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't say that earlier, but I did want to bring that up. Vote NYC, vote.nyc it should be. Thank you.
Echo, I understand you may have to leave us early. Do you have a few last words before you depart?
I have another 10, 15 minutes, so let the other speaker go, and then I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you for your patience. COVID world makes everything a little crazy.
We now get to the issue of litigation. Several of us have been involved in post-election litigation in the past. This year, with a lead up to the election, there has been more litigation than we've ever seen before by far. And I wonder if this portends to a lot more post-election litigation. So Marty Connor, how does litigation protect candidates, voters, and elections? Old days, new days, future, the Supreme Court, a lot of issues to look at there.
Thank you, Henry. I'm going to digress for a minute, because once upon a time I went searching and I found a case book put out in 1878 called Election Cases in the United States. And what I learned from that, I found a New York case, and it referenced a grave concern by the legislature and the public over the undue influence of money in politics and in elections. So the legislature in the 1820s passed a law making it a crime for anyone to contribute or spend, including candidates or parties, any money in an election except for newspaper ads, handbills to hand out, or printing ballots, because of course the candidates printed their own ballots, or the parties did and gave them out. The state didn't print ballots then. And the highest court in the state, 28 years later, ruled that that was so, and that it was unlawful, a misdemeanor in fact, for someone to put a wigwam on Broadway to support Tippecanoe and Tyler too in the wig line. So all these problems we have now, language problems. Ever wonder why every political party in New York State is required to have an emblem as their official emblem? The Democrats have a star, the Republicans an eagle, every other party has. That goes back to a concern about immigrants who weren't, who had it as their first language, other languages. And so that the politicians could say, vote for the star, vote for the eagle, and they'd vote down the party line. So in our democracy, we're evolving and dealing with these problems, but these are problems that people have been trying to address for almost 200 years. In terms of litigation this year, for the primary, and in the press, oh, look at all the litigation. The fact is, with respect to a primary, the opportunity to have the Supreme Court of the state of New York, a judge, review decisions made by election officials on the validity of ballots, you have to commence that proceeding within 10 days of primary day. And to commence an election proceeding in New York, it's not just filing like in every other proceeding where you stop the statute. You have to file and complete service on all the necessary parties. In the case of a post-election thing, necessary parties would be the Board of Elections, and every candidate on the ballot, even somebody who got 10 votes and really out of it, has to be served, or the court has no jurisdiction to rule on disputed ballots. In the case of a primary, the court actually could, if it found sufficient irregularities or fraud, overturn the primary and order a new primary. That's a 10-day statute. So what we all confronted after the primaries, we had clients who, some were behind, some were ahead, but they were ahead by what would have been in an assembly race very comfortable 2,000 votes. Any other year, election night, 2,000 votes, you'd say you won, except 60% of the votes cast in that election were on absentee ballots that weren't going to be counted until at least 7 days later. And by the time it got organized, the board did all the research and all, they didn't start counting at the Board of Elections until 10 or 11 or 12 days after the primary. If you sat back and said, well, let's see what happens, and you found out your client was behind by 3 votes, and you'd identified 20 ballots that were ruled invalid that you believe should have been legally declared valid, you had no remedy. You weren't in court, you missed the statute, you were out of it. So the press got all excited about so many lawsuits, and most of them were really just a precautionary thing. It would have been malpractice not to counsel a client. Hey, if you want to protect your rights, you got to start this court proceeding before you really know what the heck's going on, because 60% of the votes haven't been counted yet. For a general election, the statute's 20 days after election day. Again, you don't wait till the last day because you'll never get service and jurisdiction. You have to bring it a few days, at least a few days before that. In a general election, a New York State court can't overturn the election. General elections in New York are final. Final. 1 vote margin is final. Prove irregularities doesn't matter. Okay, fraud's different, but fraud's hard to prove, as we all know, because you have to prove who committed the fraud and who would benefited, which is very difficult to do. So general elections are final, but the court does have the jurisdiction to rule on disputed ballots. And if the result gets very, very close, you naturally want to have, you always want to have somewhere to appeal. And if you want to go to Supreme Court, um, you have to have that proceeding in place. Now, in New York City, realistically, there aren't that many. There's only a few districts where it's possible that it could be a close election, frankly. And we all know that. Not true in the rest of the state. Upstate, you will likely have a lot of close elections for judgeships and local offices in a year like this, and you have to resort to the if you want to go to court, you have to bring your case ahead of time. So, and of course, everybody having to start court cases gave the impression to the press like, oh, things are chaotic, whatever. Frankly, I thought the board, having been handed at the last moment this huge task of counting, I think it was something like 15 times the number of absentee ballots that they ever had to count in a primary election. General election is going to be more. And their system was designed to count the usual somewhere between 3 and 5 or 6% of the votes in an exceptional year that would be absentee. And here they had 60% of the votes in some places that were on absentee ballots. And nobody gave them the lead time or the funding to hire a lot of more people. I have been told by people at the board that they are now planning in the larger counties, opening up with 40 different counting tables for absentee ballots. They're looking for space, and John probably knows it. I'm sure he knows this. So it won't be like we experienced in the primary where there was a scramble to find space, because not just the space you needed to set up the tables where you would have a bipartisan team to canvass the ballots with watchers there. You had to do this with social distancing, so you needed far more space. I think the board's, from what I hear, the board has addressed, that and found some very, very large venues for counting ballots, and 40 tables at a time. I mean, I think in the primary, the most we got to any county was maybe 12 tables going at once, or 14 tables. So hopefully they will get it done. The federal law, we're talking about the presidential election, the federal law prescribes certain features, including the safe harbor. Basically, you have to certify your electors by, it'll be, I think, December 8th this year. But generally, it differs to the state judicial process. I mean, the state process is supposed to be carried out, and the state has to complete that, including their judicial process with respect to the election of electors by December 8th. That, if you look at it, we've had state senate races where they're counting ballots into the next January. Can't do that with electors. That's going to have to get done. If you look at it, the 7 days of receiving ballots up until the 10th of November, then you have a lot of holidays in there. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to be counting ballots on Thanksgiving Day. It has to be done pretty quickly, and the board knows that. And from what I hear, they're gearing up for a major effort.
Marty, this leads into one of the questions we've got. So let me read the question, and then, those of you who are knowledgeable can answer. The question from Rachel Landy is, the governor issued an executive order directing boards of elections to take steps to expedite the canvass of absentee ballots. Has New York City made any changes in the canvass practice to comply with the executive order?
Well, I think one thing I addressed is just the scale that they're, 40 tables going at once. And, and most of those tables aren't going to have watchers because there aren't going to be close elections involved. And as Sarah pointed out earlier, we did see in the primary where watchers were insisting, and board employees would, when they opened the envelopes, would hold up every ballot. Well, that's what you do in a hand count when it's very, very close. That's not what you should be doing. You should be scanning it. Who cares if there's an extraneous mark? The scanner will either pick it up or it won't. Nobody looks at the ballots when you're in a polling place to see if you had an extraneous mark and says that's invalid. You put it in the scanner. If the scanner counts it, it counts it. If it doesn't count it, it doesn't count it. That's the way the absentee ballots need to be treated. If it ever comes within the, what is it, 0.5% margin, which triggers in New York City an automatic hand count, then you look at every ballot. And that slowed things down enormously.
Marty, I think what Marty said is true. We've taken steps at the board level to find additional spaces, to find additional employees, to expedite as much as possible the count of the ballots. Of course, we're limited by the statutory requirements of waiting 7 days and providing access to the viewers to come in and see if they, to supervise the ballot and to see what the count is going on. But, we're doing everything we can. It's not like we've done nothing. And now we've had a little bit more time to prepare than last time when it was thrust upon us rather quickly. So we've tried to take as many steps as we can to get additional employees and additional locations that we can set up the count of the ballots, the count of the absentee ballots as quickly as possible. I know people are looking at large halls on Staten Island. We don't expect to have the need to move to another location. We're just going to push all the equipment to the back and make as much room as we can and have it there. But steps have been taken. It just, you might not see them, but they're in place, and we still have to count subject to the requirements of the statute.
As absentee ballots are being returned, are they being reviewed for validity then, so that come election day or 2 days after election day, the only thing left to do is to open them and count them?
That's kind of a two-pronged question, a multi-pronged question. When the ballots come in, they are initially reviewed. The absentee ballot envelopes come in, they're initially reviewed. But we can't do anything until we see who has actually voted in person.
No, but John, you can review them, and if it's missing a signature, you have to review them when they come in and notify the voter. Yeah.
That's part of the process for the cure that the statute provides for. We will have, once when a ballot comes in, it's reviewed, it's checked by a bipartisan team. They will send notice out to the voter at either the address, or if we have an email or a telephone, to advise them of a cure procedure. But they are gone through during the process of gearing up for the actual voting. Simplest thing is taking them and putting them in the proper order so that they're in the ED/AD for examination. Takes time and is done during that process. So that's, that is done while it's an ongoing process, both before and after the election.
Echo, last words before you leave, and we'll go on. The others are sticking around.
I'm very grateful to have been invited. Thank you for having me. Thank you for all those who sat in and listened. As everyone said, I know this stuff sometimes seems like dry inside baseball, but in fact, crafting elections that make sure we pick our politicians and not vice versa, it should be the most meaningful thing. We used to have a line, whatever your top priority is, voting should be your second.
Thank you. Marty, do you have anything more on?
No, I mean, that's, we've all experienced the general elections where the count took until December and litigation took till January or February. That certainly can't happen with respect to electors for president. Can happen for other offices where you don't have the December 8th drop dead provision that applies.
Sorry, Marty. It's interesting to remember that the swearing in of the president and used to take place in March before it was moved to January. And there were very good reasons why it was in March.
Took that long to count the votes.
Took that long to count the votes and took that long to get the people to Washington. We may want to have to rethink this entire schedule in the future.
Well, that leads up to one of the questions we got that asked, doesn't it make more sense for US federal elections to be run by the federal government as is done in other countries with federal systems? Has there been any movement in this direction in the past?
That would take one heck of a constitutional amendment. Constitution says the people who get to vote in federal elections are the people who meet the qualifications for voting in the most numerous branch of the state legislature. The states have always run elections in this country. And I don't know that, I keep reading people saying, well, we have to, it's not fair. The US said it's not fair. And we should have, it should be based on population of the states. And what a lot of people aren't aware of, there is only one section of the US Constitution that's not subject to the amendment process. That's the equal representation of the states in the Senate. It would take the unanimous consent of the states to change that. And I'm sure some little state would say, no way, we want 2 senators, just like everybody else. So running the election as a state, the Constitution gives it to the states. Actually, what it gives to the states is it says the states shall select the electors. It doesn't say you have to have an election of the public.
But this also affects congressional elections. And in terms of the one person, one vote doctrine, the rules in Texas may be very, very different from the rules in New Hampshire or Vermont or somewhere else. I mean, there are people who are eligible to vote in some states who are simply ineligible to vote in other states. Felons is one example.
Mm-hmm.
Larry, is this something Brennan Center has looked at all?
Well, my guess is that a lot of people that are speaking here at this webinar would say that it makes sense that we run elections at a state and local level, and I think there's a lot of leaving aside what's in the Constitution. And of course, the Elections Clause does give Congress the power to kind of set some rules on time, place, and manner for elections. We have really complicated elections in the United States, and we're an extremely diverse country, and there are very different ways that you're going to need to, language is one of them, but you're going to need to run elections in New York City than you are in a rural county in Iowa. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently because, obviously we've been hearing a lot about, the president saying, I might not accept the results of the election, and people worried like, is the president going to cancel the election? Of course, he can't do that. And I do think that for those that are worried about, one person or one agency manipulating our elections, it's very difficult to do in the United States because it's so decentralized. So that's an argument for decentralization. Having said that, to your point, Henry, so I don't know that we can have one agency and one set of rules for the entire country. The Brennan Center certainly, and I don't think we're alone in this, believes that there are certain minimum standards that we should have throughout the country because, of course, we're all watching what's going to be happening in Florida and North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Michigan this fall and Iowa. Those states are going to have a huge impact on how we as American citizens live, and sitting here in New York, we've got a lot less say about those elections and the way that they're run. So I think there's room for some more standards for national elections.
I mean, we do have some in terms of like overseas voters, a special federal ballot, which we use in New York, and
Well, we have lots, right? I mean, you have,
yeah,
well, you do have national laws around elections like the NVRA and.
You have the Voting Rights Act. We
Mhm.
do have,
Mhm.
you know, the Help America Vote Act. We have all these other things that are out there. But to anybody who poses that question, I just will remind them that we are still a republic made up of sovereign states. And the states have always historically had the power of running the elections in their state.
I guess we could have another panel on the efficacy of that, but we won't do that tonight. John, there's a technical question for you, which is, will the New York City Board have a supplemental list of inactive voters for election voters who are in fact inactive and not on the active list?
What we will have is on the poll pads, which are what I spoke about earlier, where people sign in, there will be active voters and there will be inactive voters listed, but the inactive voters will be gray barred to show that they are inactive, so that they will then be told what they have to do to become active voters, either do an affidavit or do whatever they have to, you know, to go in and do it. But they will be there on the list. And there will be a difference between who is active and who is inactive.
But if an inactive voter votes, doesn't that automatically make them active again?
Yes, it will. It'll make, if they're allowed to vote, they go in and do it. The only thing they have to do is make sure is they are in that district. They still live there. If they're in the wrong district, then we'll tell them to go to the right one. Or, you know, if they insist, they'll take an affidavit.
Will they get to vote on the machine if they're in the right district, or will they have to vote by affidavit?
That's an interesting question. I believe that they should be able to, they should be voting by affidavit at that case, because we have nothing to make them active. We need something in writing, something there to say that they're an active voter at that location. You know, until we get something in writing that does it, which is usually either a request for registration or a change in ballot or something, then they're still inactive. And they should vote by affidavit.
All right. I've been asking questions. Do any members of the panel have questions for each other or other comments they want to add? We have a few more minutes.
I do have a question.
Yes.
With the state's new financing, public financing, and in the times that we're in, how are they feasibly going to make good on this new law to have public financing for state elections?
My answer to that is, you know, elections are pretty important and we should always be trying to do them on the cheap. You spend what you have to spend. When the commission was established, one of the requirements was that it costs not more than $100 million a year. And the program that came out when it was costed out came in at significantly less than that. Not an insignificant amount, but probably in the $60 to $70 million range. But it's public elections, and the question is a matter of priorities. And there are other sections of the law, and financing has to be provided to do it. It's not going into effect for another couple of years, so they've got time to gear up for it. And hopefully by then, Donald Trump's vaccine will have come in, will have been effective, and we'll be past the pandemic, and the economy will be moving along again. And New York State will have the money to do what it has to do. But it's now a legislative mandate. The legislature adopted the law with knowing the financial requirements, and they now have to budget for it. Marty, you were in the legislature. How do you deal with it? The law says we have to do it, but we don't
have to pay for it. You have to pay for what you pass. I mean, although Doug knows this well, when the legislature mandated local filers filing with the State Board of Elections, it brought in what, 20 or 30,000 more filers to the state board that they had to deal with. And I actually was one of the, on behalf of the conference, was asked to negotiate with then Governor Spitzer's people. And I said, yeah, it's fine. You want to do that election reform, but you got to give the state board of elections more money because you're giving them a heck of a lot more work to do. And I think, was it 15 or 20 million dollars? They said, oh yeah, we'll do that. And they put in the next budget, $15 million, I think, for the state board, maybe 20. And Spitzer became history, and David Patterson was governor, and state's overall fiscal situation wasn't good. And the state board never got the money. They got the filers, though. They still have them. So, unfortunately, very often legislative bodies, I see the legislature we've had a very active legislature in terms of election changes and election reforms, but they don't back it up with resources for the boards of elections, either local boards or the state board. The people have to do it. They just say, oh, what a great idea we have. Let's have every board of elections do whatever, or let's mandate it.
Well, Marty, I do want to speak up and say that de Blasio and a lot of the suburban county executives stepped up to the plate and put up the money. And I think John will confirm that the mayor's office hasn't rejected any reasonable requests for funding, even though those requests have been very substantial.
To this point, yes, we've been fortunate in that the needs of the board have been met. We do, however, need new equipment, and that will be a major purchase in the future. And I don't know if we have support for anybody for that yet.
Well, John, one of the things in the state law when it comes to equipment is that if the state board of elections agrees with the local board that the equipment is necessary, the law provides that we can authorize the purchase, and the funds will be deducted from the city's state revenue sharing. And that provision was raised recently when the Westchester Board of Legislators raised concerns about certain equipment that Westchester wanted to purchase. And the county executive was in favor of it, but they pointed out that if the legislature doesn't authorize it, they'll simply go to the state and force the county to pay for it anyway.
Let's hope we don't get to that point.
That's right. And at least in New York City, with the current mayor, he seems to be fully committed to funding elections where necessary.
One more year anyway.
That's right.
Doug, with the passage of the constitutional amendment, assuming it's approved, so we now have essentially no fault absentee voting. Is there any reason why New York State can't do what other states have done and simply send out ballots to every voter?
They could do that. Is it a good idea? That's the real question.
Well, you've seen what's
If
happened.
you send out a ballot to every voter, then you're and you want to count those ballots on election night, then those voters can't vote in person on the machine. They're going to have to cast provisional ballots if they want to vote in person. And
So what?
Then Doug, nobody could vote in person.
I mean, we would have to amend our laws, but what other states call for example, states like Virginia that I litigated in and Florida, where they send out ballots, they allow you an opportunity to cancel your requested ballot or your ballot, fill out an affidavit, and then still cast your vote in person instead of filing a provisional ballot. So I think I think it's one of those things we need to look at as we continue to grow and as we see the results with people during this pandemic in voting numbers. But I think there are states that we could learn from that, one, send out ballots to every eligible voter or allows individuals to request a ballot. Two, allows that individual to cancel that ballot in writing at the poll. And then three, lets them place an actual meaningful ballot, meaning a non-provisional ballot. So I think there are states that are doing this already and are doing it very well. So I just don't, and I'm sorry for kind of cutting in, but I just want to say that there are states that are doing this that we could learn from. You know, maybe it's not something that happens right away, and maybe there's more research that needs to be done about it. But by no means is this, you know, a new idea or something that's not happening in other states.
Yeah, I would echo that. In a lot of states that are no excuse or even where significant portions of the public votes by mail, they have processes where you don't have to get a provisional ballot. When you go into the polls, you bring your ballot with you. It's canceled. I would say, you know, there are probably steps in between. A number of states allow you to get on, like Arizona, for instance, get on a permanent list. And a lot of these states have seen gradually the percentage of people on the rolls increase. I think one step that New York would really have to take is you've got to have really good, accurate, up-to-date registration rolls if you're going to be mailing everybody a ballot. And you look at the states that have, you know, outside of this year, that have very high percentage of people voting by mail or all mail states. They've got automatic voter registration, which we now have in New York. And they have very good, accurate rolls. So that's for sure a step that New York would have to take in between.
The state of Colorado has an extraordinarily good system like that, but the state of Colorado also has about 3 million total population.
Yeah, although I know California's pretty close to, well, and I think even in this election, they're doing all mail. California was pretty close. They had something like 70% in recent elections voting by mail.
But they take several weeks to get the ballots counted, and the system in Colorado basically allows for election day night results.
There are, of course, at least 3 states, Washington, Oregon, and Utah, that are all mail ballots at this point, right?
They're more, actually.
Arizona too, aren't they?
Arizona is very high, but it's not up there. Hawaii went all mail, and there are 5. So I'm not sure which ones I forgot which ones you mentioned, but there are 5 that prior to this year were all mail, and in fact there are another 4 for this election that are going all mail.
All right. We have a question. Maybe John, you can answer this. If a person's affidavit or absentee ballot isn't counted, is the voter notified that their ballot was not counted?
Well, there's 2 parts to that. If it's an absentee ballot and there's something wrong with it, they will be, and it's curable, they will be notified to have the opportunity to come in and cure. If the time goes beyond that and they haven't cured or it's an incurable error, then they are notified by mail.
And affidavit ballots?
Same thing. They are notified by mail.
We've got about 5 more minutes. Does anybody have anything else they want to add at this point?
Well, I guess I should add for the voting public that this is not my office behind me. This is an this is an artifice that I put forward. I wish it was my office or my home, but this is a background.
I just want to mention very quickly that in the chat, there is an agenda that does have the bios of the speakers, also resources for those of you who would like to volunteer for election protection. And we'll also try to, we'll circulate that to attendees as well.
Okay, and I would like to thank Catherine and Shanice, our committee chairs, for pulling this together, and also thank all of the sponsors of this, the Election Law Committee and the Diversity Pipeline Initiative Committee of the New York City Bar Association, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Caribbean Attorneys Network, the Centro Civico Cultural Dominicano, the Dominican Bar Association, the Hispanic National Bar Association Region 2, Latino Justice PRLDEF, PERLDEF, the Malcolm B. Allen Black Bar Association, the Metropolitan Black Bar Association, the Muslim Bar Association of New York, the National Bar Association Region 2 Election Protection Committee, and the South Asian Bar Association. And please remember, early voting starts on Saturday. So make a plan to vote and get all your friends, relatives, and enemies to make plans and get them out to vote. Any last words?
Again,
Thank you
your-
so
your-
much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Your early voting site can be found on the New York City Board of Elections website, vote.nyc. It'll have the locations and the hours. You have 9 days and plenty of hours to vote early. Avoid
Hey,
the
we-
lines.
We will circulate the agenda to the participants. I want to thank each presenter so much. Thank you so much for your time at a time when you are so busy with so many important things. Thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight. Thank you very much.